8C was a difficult question. I think the average of 50% is actually quite strong given what you were asked to do. So what you were told was other expenses for November totaled $58,000 and that had GST of $1,560. The business made one payment of $9,750 to the Australian Tax Office for GST on the 29th of November. So there's a total of 4 marks here. What you're asked to do was show how the GST clearing account would appear in the ledger, and you are not required to balance the account. So to answer that, we want to just start with the basics. What is GST clearing? It is a liability account, so that means it goes up on the credit side and it goes down on the debit side. So now we want to ask, well, what transactions make it go up and down? So GST clearing goes up when we collect GST on sales in the form of cash. That's not the business's money, it needs to go to the government, so that will increase our liability. The opposite of that is we pay GST in cash on our purchases, so that would decrease our liability. The other way our GST clearing liability will go up is when we charge GST to our debtors on credit sales. And the opposite of that would be when we get charged GST by our creditors, that will decrease our liability. What we need to remember though is that that's not everything that could happen. We could end up at the end of the month with a final balance that's not zero. So in this case, let's just pretend we've got some numbers here. Let's say we collected $600 in GST. That would go in as a credit. We paid $1,000. That would be a debit. We charged our debtors $300 and our creditors charged us $1,400. Well, at the end of the month, if we balance that ledger out, we're going to end up with a debit balance of $500. So what does that mean? It actually means this GST asset is no longer a liability. It means it's actually an asset. So in this case, it's owed money by the tax office. So what would happen is eventually the tax office would give the business the $500 back, and that would offset the GST clearing account by $500 to balance it back to zero. So a GST settlement in terms of a refund would actually show up as a credit in GST clearing. Sometimes though the opposite happens. If we plug in some numbers and say we collected cash of GST of $1,200, we paid $700 GST, charged debtors $800 and got charged $300 by creditors. If we balance that ledger out, we're actually going to end up with a credit balance of $1,000. So that circumstance means that we actually have a liability. We owe the government $1,000. So in that case, what would happen is eventually we would pay the government the $1,000, which would decrease our cash asset, and it would actually show up as a debit to GST clearing, as it is going to decrease our liability back to zero. So in that circumstance, we're actually going to show a GST settlement payment would actually show up as a liability. Now that we've gone through that, we can do a full list. Every GST transaction has to be either GST collected on sales, paid on purchases, GST charged to debtors or charged by creditors, but also when we get a settlement from the government, that would show up as a liability, and when we pay a settlement to the government, that would show up as a debit. All we've got to do now is go and find those transactions one by one, even in fact they do exist. So from the facts of the case, other expenses for November were $58,000 plus GST of $1,560. The issue here is the exam question was poorly worded. It doesn't say were these all paid with cash. So the assumption in the solutions is they were, but poor question, it didn't actually say that. So I'm going to put that in as a debit for cash payments of GST. Now, it does say the business made one payment of $9,750 to the ATO during November. So what that must mean is there was an opening balance which was a liability in red. We can see that here. We must have owed $9,750 at the start of the month and then paid that back, and that's our settlement in terms of a payment. So the next thing we were given was in question 8A and B, we had to complete this stock card and some general journal entries. So the first thing we were told was there was a purchase of stock for a total of $161,700. That stock had GST on it, so we were charged $16,170 by our creditors, so that would have shown up as a debit. The next transaction we were given was we made sales of stock costing $154,000 on credit. So that's going to show up as a credit entry in GST clearing to debtors control. The issue is how much. Is it 10% of $154,000? And the issue here is that's actually not the right number. The number we need is not the cost price, we need the sale price. So what we're told is we sold 200 paddleboards for $1,540 each. So if we go and divide that by 11, that'll give us the GST on each unit. So we sold 200 units. Now if we do $1,540 divided by 11, we get $140 GST on each sale. Therefore, in total, we charged our debtors $28,000 of GST, so that would show up as our credit next to debtors control there. Now that we've done all that, we've got a stock loss entry. Now, a stock loss entry doesn't actually have GST, so we don't need to do anything. And we also had a stock write-down entry, which again doesn't have GST, so we didn't need to do anything. So what we're left with is the following ledger, which we don't need to balance if we read the question. So what we've got to do is find 4 marks here. So we've got a mark for the cash paid on GST purchases. We've got the GST charged on the settlement, so the actual settlement of the opening balance, and GST from the credit purchases of stock. And our 4th mark was for the GST charged on credit sales to our debtors. Interestingly enough, you didn't need to have a mark for an opening balance, therefore if you didn't include it, you didn't lose a mark. I just put it in to show how the 9750 debit did come about. Looking at the marks of this question, tough question, 27% of the state got 0. At the top end though, very pleasingly, a quarter of students were able to get 4 marks, 4 out of 4, with an average of 50% or 2. Looking at the examiner's comments, some students had difficulty figuring out the GST on the credit sales. Remember to use the sale price and not the cost price from the stock card. And always use the correct ledger titles when entering your cross references. So we're not writing credit purchases, we're writing creditors control, for example.